Good morning. I'm Greg Hummel. I'm a partner with Bryan Cave in Chicago. I run our public-private partnership practice, and I have the honor of moderating this panel on New Life from Old Bones. It's about transformation. The 21st century has been defined really by transformation. There's change in every era, but there really seems to be more now. And we're in the epicenter of that change from an economic point of view with the creative economy. So it's fitting that at ULI we begin to focus on how that affects land use. And our theme today is adaptive reuse of buildings. In the July-August issue of Urban Land, they feature 10 transformative such projects, adaptive reuses, power plants, you're going to hear about that today, cold storage, that's another example of what we're going to address. I'd also like us to think about a broader series of themes, and that is how these transformations and some of the demographic trends and business service trends also lead into remaking cities, remaking neighborhoods. In Chicago, you will discover that our central business district is expanding in ways that are pretty profound, and the project that you'll hear about today relates to that. Similarly, in San Francisco, there's been a change where the geography has taken development. So we're pleased today to have really 4 true experts in this field of adaptive reuse and transformative real estate development. Starting to my right, Michael Covarrubias is a speaker who's also the CEO and chairman of a company, TMG Partners in San Francisco. His colleague is Matt Field, who's the chief investment officer of that company. Then, moving further to my right, is John Gavin, the investment principal of Sterling Bay, and Patrick O'Connor, the principal and director of construction. The way the morning will lay out is we'll hear from these leaders about their companies briefly and then deep dives on their projects. That will take on the order of a half an hour of our time. And then the balance of our time will relate to Q&A, some of which I will lead, some of which the panelists will interact themselves, and some of which you'll have an opportunity to participate in this subject. So without further ado, Michael.
Hi, good morning. I am also acting as one of the co-chairs of this committee, so I'm going to make sure you all get double bonus points for being here on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. So yeah, we're looking forward to doing this. We're going to give you a little bit of overview about the company. We're a privately owned development company, only operate in the Bay Area, but we do all the different product types from office to housing and retail and mixed use. We've been doing it for some 32 years. The slide is now dated. And we've been very active in San Francisco in particular, the South Bay in particular, and more over the history of the company in the East Bay. We love what we call difficult deals. The more value they need added to them, the better we can do. As you can see, we've done about 23 million square feet. $3.5 billion of assets have been developed. So our mantra is we're not very product focused. We'll do most anything because we try to make it depend upon what the site wants. But we're religious about the market. We believe it's a local market to be in the development business, so we just do the Bay Area. In San Francisco, which is where we're going to talk about our project today, we've done about 20 different developments, mostly south of Market, which you've heard a lot about in the last few days, mostly with tech companies and a lot of historic rehab. So this one today that Matt is going to drive you through is one of our prouder moments. We were able to pick this up in the crash of the financial crisis after 2008 and 9, and you'll see it's a very beautiful building. As you can tell, we don't know why we wanted to fix it, but there she was in her glory, and Matt will give you the history.
Thanks, Mike. I'll run you through, pardon me, a profile of the asset and the transformation. This building was built in 1964 for Pacific Bell. It's located right where we are. When you leave this building, you'll actually be able to look out and see the building. It doesn't look like that anymore, but right smack in central Soma. It didn't always look like this. This is 1974. That all those big parking lots are where the Moscone Center is located today. So this building, when it was built, this part of town really was Skid Row on 6th Street, 5th Street. A lot of this was really run down. And there were a few buildings south of Market that were generally occupied by the telephone company. Pretty much all the buildings on the right-hand side south of Market were telephone company buildings, and there was a Wells Fargo data center down here, but that was about it. The history of San Francisco office development really has gone through 3 or 4 major phases. In the 70s and even the 80s, development really occurred north of Market Street in the traditional downtown. It then migrated south of Market, but really into what we know as the South Financial District, and it stayed along the waterfront. And ultimately, it came back to this part of town after the convention center had been developed and hotels and residential. This was really the 24/7 part of town. So same slide, same area, 2010. You can see how much things have filled in, but the building still looks the same. In 2006, SPC decided to vacate the building and sell, and they actually vacated a number of buildings here in South of Market at this time. It's a 3-building site, about 2 acres, and it wraps on 2 city blocks from 3rd and Folsom down an alley called Hawthorne Lane. The building was beautiful. They left it in perfect condition. It truly had never been renovated. It had very low ceilings, very shallow depths, and the building was generally perceived to be so bad that it was going to be a teardown. It was marketed, the marketing brochure cover is on the right. It was sold as a teardown to put up 750 units of condo on the site. We looked at it differently. We thought it was an office deal, and we saw a few things about it that to us screamed staying office. One, we thought there was inherent value in the existing building. Despite it having no systems that were usable, despite how ugly it was, the structure and the permits alone from the city of San Francisco, we thought were worth about $100 a foot. The building has a great location in Soma, and I think at the time we did this, it really wasn't seen as an office location, but we saw this as the 24/7 part of town, and just office hadn't been built here in a long time, but we didn't think that made it a bad office location. In fact, we thought there were a lot of things about it that were more attractive. Had very, very tall deck to deck. I can't explain to you why it was built this way, but it was 15 feet deck to deck. The floor plates were about twice the size of a typical San Francisco building. Most San Francisco buildings are about 15 to 18,000 feet. These were over 30,000 feet, pardon me, and the parking was vastly in excess of code because the building had been built so long ago. We looked at reskinning and expanding the building, and that was a much faster path to entitlement than tearing the building down and starting over and needing a new environmental impact report. We also were worried that the risk of the residential project to us was duration. A very long time to entitle, build, and absorb 750 units. And to us, that we just said there's too much cycle risk, thinking that you can build 3 different towers and sell them out without catching the bad side of a cycle. And frankly, the architecture we thought we could fix. It was an ugly building, but the bones of the building were good. So our plan was to transform the building with a new skin and expansion both horizontally and vertically. So you can see we're adding 2 floors to the building vertically, and horizontally there's a number of extensions to the floor. We hired Skidmore, Owings & Merrill as the architects, and when we did this expansion, we ended up with 9 corners on the building by pulling it out on each side of the building. And we were finding that as we got bigger floor plate users, there's more competition for corner offices or corner conference rooms, and having those extra corners was a big deal. We redesigned virtually everything about the building, the skin, the lobby. In fact, we cut the core out of the middle of the building. It had been built as a single-tenant building, predating modern codes, and we found it was less expensive and more efficient to cut the middle of the building out and just reframe it the way we wanted to use it. The building systems were all new, including the elevators, which were destination dispatch. It was the first destination dispatch elevator ring by Mitsubishi done in San Francisco. For those of you that don't operate in the West or in a seismic zone, one of the things we're really, really concerned about is the seismic performance of buildings, especially when you're renovating a building. And what a PML is a probable maximum loss study, and it's undertaken by the insurance industry to look at damageability of buildings. And we've had a lot of experience with buildings like this, and we've found that we can fix buildings in excess of what the code would require, and we can drive value that way. So we're going to have to fix the building anyway to meet code. And in this case, we engineered the building to have what is extremely low PML. 12% is 20 is sort of the institutional threshold, so that's 20% damageability to a building. And we found that ultimately institutional buyers really will latch onto this. The building had great signage, opportunity for decks, and we engineered it to be LEED Core and Shell Platinum. So here you can see these 4 areas. We expanded the floor plate and how the core got rebuilt. We're overlaying the new core over the old core. When we got the building, it had a square core inside a rectangle. So it was shallow on 2 sides and deep on 2 sides, and we regularized that. And I'll just walk you through the construction process really quickly. Here we are starting the cutting out the core, taking the skin off the building. New glass back onto the building, and ultimately this is what the asset looks like. That is a photograph. It actually looks like the rendering, which is always nice when that happens. Sometimes the rendering looks better than the building, it didn't turn out well. So that's a quick profile of 680. Here's a couple of interiors. Large roof deck. And one thing you'll notice, everybody thinks tech means that you don't have ceilings and it's brick and timber. I would tell you, I think we see a lot of mature companies that have building standards and they drop ceilings because they're dealing with acoustic issues, and they build more than one office, so they have standards. Growing companies often don't do that, but if you see, Google's office space, they have ceilings. Apple's got ceilings. There you go.
Thank you, Matt. John?
Thank you. Sterling Bay is a boutique investment and development firm located in Chicago. We've been operating since 1986 with a very narrow strategy, much like TMG. We try to identify overlooked or underutilized office assets and create unique environments. Unlike San Francisco and New York and some of the other coastal markets, we haven't seen the demand characteristics that you guys have seen in those coastal cities for these types of tenants. That's changed recently. In the last 5 years, we've embarked on $1 billion worth of projects, all demand driven by these tenants coming to Chicago. We're going to focus on one particular project, which is 1000 West Fulton, 1K Fulton. We're going to focus on the technical acumen of the asset because it's a very unique execution and hasn't been seen in the nation, but I think one other time. It's converting a frozen cold storage building into creative office space. So it was an amazing execution, which frankly, we had nothing to do with. It's all of our head of construction, Patrick O'Connor, who's been executing these investment theses for about 20 years. So I'll turn it over to him and he'll talk through the project.
Sure, thanks, John. As the folks from TMG mentioned, these projects are always technically challenging in everything from reskinning a building to all new systems. Groups like ours, Sterling Bay, TMG, others included, have rehabbed over the years many commercial office buildings, and you kind of know what the usual pitfalls are. This one was completely different. This building was built in the late 1920s as a commercial cold storage building, and by cold storage, it's basically a refrigerator. So the building you see on the left is the old building before we started. You've got a 10-story, 380,000 foot warehouse building that's literally frozen solid. And when I say frozen solid, I mean frozen solid. So picture the inside of your freezer. Some floors of this building were 3, 4, 5, 6 feet of ice. And so I would, in terms of lessons learned, always hire a good photographer to document this stuff early in the process, because honestly, folks wouldn't believe some of the stuff that we found in the building. But getting back in time a little bit to our investment thesis, this building is really a mile from the central business district in Chicago, and in the Fulton market, burgeoning loft and creative office district. We saw the opportunity, just as TMG did, to perform an execution possibly quicker than a ground-up construction project. And also, because our building was existing non-conforming, we had about 380,000 feet of structure on the site that we could reuse if we could salvage the structure. And if we had knocked the thing over and started again, we maybe could have built 100, 110,000 feet. So that 380,000 feet of existing non-conforming FAR had a lot of value to us. So challenges for a project like this, many. Certainly we had a lot of nasty environmental conditions, which I'll talk about. We had to dismantle the project in an orderly fashion, in a safe fashion, and maintain the structural integrity of the building. We had to work with, as you do in all adaptive reuse projects, a design that was done in, say, the 1920s. So we have column layouts and that sort of thing that may not be conducive to, or as conducive as, say, a new structure, but we're used to working with that. And then, we had to get this all done while decommissioning the building and getting rid of the existing ice conditions. So in terms of challenges, there were many. I'm going to talk about 3 today. I'm going to talk about thawing out the building because I think that's a little unique. You don't usually have to thaw out a building. I'm going to talk about the salvaging the concrete structure because, as I mentioned, there was a lot of value for us in being able to reuse that 380,000 feet. And then I'll talk a little bit about the environmental conditions that we dealt with, and then maybe sum it up with a few lessons learned. So as we talked about the thaw, we hired a lot of good consultants on this job, and that certainly in terms of lessons learned is bring in really smart consultants and challenge those consultants to be creative and come up with creative ideas and creative processes for dealing with it. We probably went through 6 or 8 or 10 dry runs on how to actually thaw out this building and what some of the issues were going to be, how much the building was going to thermally expand when we thawed it out, how we were going to deal with things like the brick skin, which was very loosely held onto the building at this point, how that was going to react to the building thawing. There's an old light buried in the ice. You don't see that in most buildings. This is a great video, if we can get it to play, of the thaw. If not, I can send folks a link to, we did a time lapse of the thaw process here, but that's about 6 or 8 feet of ice, a few million pounds of ice in this building that we had to deal with. So how to deal with the few million pounds of ice turning to water in a building with no drains in it, something that personally hadn't dealt with before, but was a challenge. And then once we got it thawed, this is what we were left to deal with. A building where it hadn't really been touched since the 1920s when it was built. Looks almost like a movie set. Yeah. So once we agreed on a solution for how to get the building thawed, our engineers came up with a protocol on, modeled it, what to measure during the thaw to make sure the building wasn't moving in ways we didn't want it to move. Because once you disconnect the systems and start to thaw it, there's no going back. So we had to make sure that we fully understood how the building was going to react to the thaw process. Once we got it thawed, we were left with our 380,000-foot concrete structure, which we needed to make sure, actually before we got the building thawed, we needed to understand how much of the structure was going to be reusable. Because an old building like this, which has been through 80 years of freeze and thaw and not a lot of expert maintenance, is subject to a lot of concrete spalling, a lot of deterioration of concrete, a lot of exposed rebar. Because the old refrigeration systems in these buildings are based on a brine system, maybe some of you folks have dealt with cold storage buildings before. Very often there's a lot of damage to the concrete through brine leakage. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand where that damage might be, how extensive it might be, and how to deal with it. Once we got the building thawed again, we started to take the perimeter walls off. This building was built like an ice cooler. So the exterior of the building, the exterior skin was really separated from the structure by about 7 inches of cork insulation, and then a freestanding brick structure that you see as we started to demo the building here and let light in for the first time. You can see the space between the structure and the exterior skin. The first time we opened it up, that's the view we were dealing with from a building that had never had any windows. So obviously very attractive in terms of potential office space. One of the things we spent a lot of time on as well to understand the structure was the existing drawings. We were fortunate enough, and in this kind of renovation, it's extremely helpful to have existing drawings. We had copies of the existing blueprints, which were done on linen. our structural team spent a lot of time trying to understand how the caissons were built. We understood how the caissons were designed, but determining if they were built per design is a whole different matter. There's a good bit of excavation, there's a good bit of ultrasonic testing of apparently banging on caissons and then listening to what you hear, and apparently a lot of smart engineers know what to listen for. We also spent, there's a good shot of the structure that as we hoped it would turn out once we got it demoed. We spent a lot of time on what petrographic analysis, understanding what our concrete was doing, how it had deteriorated over the years, how the freeze-thaw had affected it, how some of the brine solution had affected it. We did a lot of ground-penetrating radar of the concrete superstructure to determine where it was going to require additional remediation work. Because as you look at this plan here of one very small area of the building, we were able to determine where the concrete was most distressed. Because a building like this has got 800 or 900 feet of perimeter on every floor of 10 floors, we're talking about 8,000 or 9,000 square feet. So places like this where we've determined we've got to chip away and repair the concrete, these could potentially be big issues. If you've got that many units of a potential issue, and you can build a new structure for $40 or $50 a foot, but to do this remedial work can run you $100, $150 a foot because it's so small and difficult to get at. These were big issues that we had to understand before we got financially committed to the deal. And then we would, as you can see, did a bunch of slab edge repair along some of these slab edges you can see from the outside. We went in and replaced a number of columns that we, through our initial analysis, when we were doing our due diligence on the building, determined we had somewhere between 25 and 30 columns that had to be fully removed and replaced. Fortunately, we estimated correctly on that and had a good repair protocol in place by the time we got to it. And you can see there's a corner of the building replaced. Another thing we did, an early decision we made on a building like this, and another lesson learned, and I would advise anyone doing this kind of building, always pour a topping slab. Covers up innumerable sins and allows you to have a pretty level floor plate, but an important tool in something like this. We designed, rather than even pretending we could reuse the existing skin on this building, we designed an all-new skin, so precast concrete with thin-set brick to mimic the old skin of the building. You can see the formwork here with the bricks laid in, and the concrete gets poured on top of that, and the bricks are then embedded in the form and then embedded in the concrete. And we replicated many of the old details in the building in precast concrete. As you can see, the precast sections going up, it allowed us to work year-round. It allowed us to predict very accurately how long it was going to take to get the building skinned versus trying to do it in hand-laid masonry and that sort of thing. Another lesson learned that's related to this is one of the earliest things we did when we were taking the building apart is we performed a 3D survey. So, 10,000 points along every surface of the building, which allowed us to model the building very accurately as we planned how to put it back together. Because as you can imagine, a building this age is out of plumb, it's out of level, it's not square. The structure itself is still out of plumb, out of level, and not square, but the skin now makes up for those deficiencies, and we knew exactly where that was going to take place. And then obviously before we could do any of that, we had to deal with the environmental issues, 20-something pounds of anhydrous ammonia, which apparently is a really noxious thing. We had to go through the process working with the Chicago Fire Department and the neighbors and the aldermen on how we were going to get that removed, because again, once you start, you need to get it all out. And as you can imagine, some of the equipment was not in the best of shape. So we had to work with things that were breaking as we were trying to dismantle them. And then as we got into the more traditional sequence of construction, it looks like any other project you're probably familiar with, but we've got the fully renovated 380,000 foot on the right-hand side, married up to the newly constructed 160,000 foot building, one contiguous floor plate of about 77,000 feet, which, as we're finding in the marketplace, the bigger the floor plate, the more attractive to tenants. Obligatory reuse of reclaimed wood and some brick. Nice clean interior office spaces. We mimicked some of the ice conditions in our lobby lighting. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much. So tell us about, this is open to both developers, your business plan and a sense of risk management, particularly as it relates to timing, when, and also as it relates to tenants. I know there's 2 or 3 different questions in that, but I was struck by the decision to keep things and therefore manage entitlement risk, and I was also struck by the way in which the concealed conditions risk were really managed with brilliant work with your teams, in the one sense on the seismic risk and the other, the prior use of the building. But tell us a little bit about how you found the tenants and how you created a business plan around these projects.
I'll start with the big picture. I've been listening to panels now for the last 2 or 3 days, like a lot of you, and I've heard the word strategy about 6,000 times. So I'd like to go on record, we had none. When we bought the building, it was clear to us that we were getting it at a price that was not replicatable. And it was at the bottom of the market, 2009 and early 2010. And so, in fact, capital was almost impossible to find because everybody had deer in the headlight syndrome. So our strategy was, it's going to be something someday. And the tear down into a residential was an option. The rehab was an option. So when we did it, we really said, this is going to be the right place. This is going to be the right structure, as Matt mentioned. There were irreplaceable asset features of the building that were tremendous, the floor-to-floors and the floor sizes. So those 2 things alone we knew at some point would be worth their weight in gold. We knew the tech market was continuing to like San Francisco, even not quite as much as they do today, but even back then we did a building at First and Market, at Market Street called Landmark at One Market that, we ended up arguing with our brokers whether anybody from the tech world would come up, and that was only in 2000. And we ended up with Salesforce and Autodesk and Microsoft, and so that tech wave really even then liked big floor plates. So our strategy was to try to figure it out. And so we bought it, we had a little bit of debt on it. Then we started looking for construction loans, which was harder than looking for ice in the desert, if I can tie the 2 projects together.
That's a good trick.
Nice segue.
It's a stretch, sorry. But, construction loans were almost impossible to think about. So all of this sort of happened at the time as we waited that the market was getting a little bit better. And we had great relationships with brokers. And we had sort of taken the project on the road. We had, in terms of talking about it, we hadn't picked a broker. And then Matt gets a phone call from, one of our great friends, and that's what started it. So maybe you can take it from there.
Sure. As Mike said, we didn't list the building. I mean, we were looking at the sort of, I'd call it the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the business gets done by 20% of the brokers, and big tenant leases are really done by very, very few guys controlling those tenants. So we started talking to people early, and my phone rang one day with a friend of ours who said, hey, I have an idea. Would you guys consider leasing the bottom of the building to Riverbed? And this is kind of developer heaven on a pre-lease, because normally the tenant wants the top of the building really cheap. And you've basically set the ceiling as opposed to the floor. If you can get them to take the bottom of the building, you've now set a floor. So we got a credit tenant to take the bottom of the building, and it was a rent that we felt didn't sell the building too cheaply and set a nice bar for the bottom, and the bottom of the building doesn't have the same outlooks that the top of the building obviously does. And we really used that as a launching pad. And as soon as that happened, one of the other guys we've been talking to called up and said, hey, I got Macy's. And then somebody called up and said, hey, I've got Yelp. And we found ourselves actually in a competitive environment with an unlisted building. So we were able to say to ourselves, we clearly like Macy's credit. How are we going to get a Cincinnati company to move at the pace of a tech company? Because tech company leases can be done relatively quickly, even big leases. Macy's doesn't do things quickly. It's just not the corporate structure to do that. I give a lot of credit to their broker, a guy named Dan Cressman, who said to him, "You got to do this deal." And we said to Dan, if you guys can make this deal, we're gonna take the Yelp deal, which ultimately, I think 5 weeks to do the Macy's lease, which Macy's had never done in their history.
And to tie it all together, with an 85% leased building, banks will talk to you again.
Yeah,
So
it's remarkable.
It was incredible. That's all we had to do to get a construction loan back then. So we did that.
And ironically though, we got down to really still only two lenders
Yeah.
at the end of the day,
Right.
and we ended up with two German banks partnering together, which you wouldn't have thought would have happened back then. So it was still not easy at the end of the day, even pre-leased.
John and Patrick?
So consistent with TMG, I'm not sure that we had a clearly defined strategy buying a frozen cold storage building at the onset. But Patrick and I both sit on the investment committee, and our partner brought to us this thesis, and I can say definitively that I was advocating not to do the investment. To provide you some context for where this building is in Chicago, it's not in a submarket. There's no existing submarket. It's obviously a frozen cold storage building, and we're contemplating creating an office space and luring tenants there. So we tasked Patrick with the opportunity to see if it's even feasible to do, and he could talk for hours about trying to quantify those risks. But we were operating with imperfect information for certain. We didn't have zoning. We were pretty confident we weren't going to be able to find financial partners to execute it. And there was no clear definition to, after you decommission the building, if the concrete superstructure was going to be a viable structure. So like all good investors or developers, we did have a backstory in case that didn't work out. It's a great piece of dirt. There was a bunch of industrial executions if it all failed. So we did have a different outcome prepared for. But I'll never forget when we took our first financial partners through, and we've had the same financial partners, family offices, for 25 years. We took them through the building, and they're like, "So what are we doing here again?" Yeah. I'm like, "Well, Patrick's going to take off the curtain wall, decommission the building, and then we're going to create a really cool tech environment." And they're like, "Good luck." So
Send me a postcard.
we ended up going all in by ourselves and trying to do enough pre-development and demonstrate proof of concept by capturing the zoning, and then demonstrating interest, and then we solved for a capital structure that worked for us. But we were not going to get financing until we landed a lease. We landed SRAM first, which is a bicycle manufacturer out of Chicago, early adopter. Everybody calls this the Google building because Google ended up taking the majority of the space in the building. But we like to think about it as a SRAM building, because had SRAM not been the early adopter here, as a cool tech tenant, which with actually great credit, not sure we would have captured Google. So we like to think about it as a SRAM building. And it's 100% occupied today in what is now the sixth submarket of Chicago, Fulton market.
Right, and if I can add one or two points from my point of view here. One of the things we had going for this deal is we had the benefit of time. You know, John mentioned some zoning work we were doing to get the vacant site where we built the new 6-story section. We had about a 10-month ramp up to get that figured out. So we had the benefit of, say, 10 months of due diligence on this building before we closed, which was really invaluable in understanding some of those key go, no-go decisions. Is the superstructure reusable? How, and to what extent are we going to have to repair it? Folks often ask, is this the most challenging execution you've ever done? I'd say no, because we had the benefit of time. I've done similarly challenging executions and Bryan knows this, in 10 months, and that's a challenge. This one we had the benefit of time.
Right. One question that, with your experience in these urban environments, I know in the Sterling Bay example, there was a major new transportation piece of infrastructure nearby, the Morgan stop on one of our lines. And we're talking to policymakers in cities. I'm close to something that's going on in Chicago now, which is a hard look at planned manufacturing districts, and where the market wants to go as opposed to that, frankly, standing in the way of the market, North Branch of the Chicago River. What are some of the lessons that you learned that you'd like the people who are in the entitlement world and in the regulatory world and also the public purse to some degree? What are some things that you've learned that they might want to hear? or need to hear?
Well, I'll speak to Chicago first off. For those of you who are not familiar with Chicago, there's an area called PMD, Planned Manufacturing Districts. I think there's 11 of them in Chicago.
It's actually more than 20.
Oh, I'm sorry, more than 20. This was in one of those areas, as is a lot of buildings that we are executing on. So from perhaps not the most noble cause, we're a real estate developer, so we're looking for undervalued assets, and we're trying to create new cool spaces and places to live and work. We think our thesis is PMDs have served a very useful purpose, and now perhaps they can serve another purpose. The city's been somewhat receptive to changing the zoning within the context of the PMDs, but as you're referencing, they're contemplating eliminating the PMDs. And what the original thought was for those was to have an infill location to protect jobs and have manufacturing facilities close into the city. Once again, our thesis is the manufacturing jobs are going away. These are the new manufacturers: SRAM, Uber, Google, Apple. They're not steel makers, they're not rubber tire makers. Those jobs are gone. So our proposal is we have a solution for these new manufacturers if you'll let us do it. And obviously very, very divisive in Chicago, very, very contentious. So if they don't want to do it, we'll look elsewhere and do developments elsewhere. If they want to protect those areas, that's fine. We're agnostic. We'll go somewhere else and do our developments.
Thank you.
I would say, one, we're in our neighborhood. Two, I can't see who's out there. So three, our process is great. Cities just
Perfect.
got it figured
Perfect.
out. Obviously, that's not true. You know, the Bay Area and San Francisco are both challenged by, you know, the attitudes of anti-development because everybody wants their place to be the same as it was when they bought it. So that's just a human instinct we have to battle. So the politicians, the planners, you know, they want growth, but it's hard, and it depends which environment you're in. San Francisco's been pretty progressive in terms of wanting the corporate headquarters to come here. The mayor put forth a strong effort to revitalize mid-market, and that's what led to the Twitter phenomenon and all that's going on around it. So, you know, Matt and I always joke about this. If it was easy, you know, anybody could do it, and we've been here 30 years, and so we kind of like it being difficult. We like the process being a pain. We like CEQA because that makes it really hard to get stuff done. And so at the end of the day, that means there won't be 5,000 buildings built to compete with. So it's a catch-22. You pull your hair out, but then you say thank you at the end, and hopefully it all works out.
I also think from our perspective, you know, we see the millennial workforce doing things, and the kind of space they're interested in is changing, and it's changing rapidly. It's been changing for a few years. It continues to change. And whether policymakers can create, whether it be zoning policy or neighborhood improvement policy that keeps pace with that change is a real challenge. Because in the period of time, say the 1K Fulton building went from being an eyesore to being home to 2,000 jobs, was really a matter of weeks, maybe months, to get the deal kind of formalized, to get a lease done, to get enough due diligence done that we were willing to do it. And we haven't necessarily seen policy move that quickly. And if urban planners want to be at the forefront of thinking about these things, they need to move at the pace of business.
I think it's a big part of why we do redevelopment as opposed to development a lot of the time. It's just the policy issues are huge, and repurposing buildings is a lot easier and a lot quicker. Even with the brain damage, we had very similar brain damage on our structure. I didn't really walk through the details, but really similar sorts of things. There's tons of brain damage, which we like, again, because I think it limits the competition. So we'd rather take redevelopment brain damage if we can't find development opportunity.
The trend that I saw, I was at the Oakland Naval Facility with Prologis on Tuesday, and I was amazed to discover that they're planning to do distribution centers in a vertical setting. And one of the things they have to engineer is how you get 5 fully loaded semis onto a second floor via a ramp. And this fulfillment notion of same-day delivery, you know, last week there were 3 large boxes. I don't know what my wife had bought, but they came to the front door. And, you know, Chicago is a real intermodal city, but it takes longer to get stuff from the Joliet Arsenal Distribution Center into the center city than it does to get it from Long Beach to Chicago. And so this adaptive reuse opportunity, I think, is huge because the building stock is there and it's close in and people can get to it. One last question I'm going to pose, and then I'm going to stand up here so I can see people out there for your questions. But from you exited early, and that's an interesting part of the story. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Actually, for, as we say, all the gory details, there's ULI puts out a very well done, I might say, summary of our project. So it's in the back of the room. It has a lot of the details we didn't cover. Yeah, our partners in this type of project are generally opportunistic. So their capital wants you to do something really well and do it really fast. That's just sort of their mantra. So in this case, when we got to where Matt got the place 85% leased, it kind of had created its value. It kind of, you kind of knew what the rents were, you knew what cap rates were, you knew how long it was going to take to build. You could project what you thought it might be worth, and then you could present value it back and say, but if you got the money tomorrow, it was kind of a win-win conversation. If somebody bought it, they'd be getting it less than they would if they waited the 2 years to get it built. So our friends at East Still put us in touch with some folks, and it ended up being Boston Properties. And this was the second time they had been in San Francisco. They own that little thing over there called the Embarcadero, those 4 or 5 buildings. And so they had decided that they like San Francisco, and we were able to, as I said, structure what we called the real win-win. We got a great price. We got it early, which in the world of capital gets your IRR up. And they bought a building for what ultimately is a great price. So that was why we sold early, because we could make it work for both parties.
I think we also, the structure worked. We took construction cost overrun risk, but we kept the savings. And we ended up coming in significantly under budget. So there was a win there as well that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And as Mike said, it was easy for us to look at if the cap rate and value today, if they'll pay us this much today, what would we have to do to be even 2 years from now? And you could look at, I would say, the math we ran versus where we were absolutely indifferent even to today's price, because we had 2 years of construction, a year of free rent to burn off before we had the income to sell. So it was really just running a few models to figure out what's the indifference point.
And Boston Properties has gone on to inundate themselves with San Francisco properties. I don't know how many they now have, but it's at least a half a dozen, including development and including that little thing called the Salesforce Tower, which will be the tallest building in San Francisco.
Well, I'm like those lenders in 2007, deer in the headlights. I can't see anybody. So
Yeah, right.
would you guys and ladies come to the mics and give us your name and pose questions, because we do have time. So somebody break the ice,
So to speak.
Hey guys, it's Tony Way here. Quick question about how you guys might be changing your investment strategy at this point in the cycle, whether it's, are you guys looking to redevelop faster, going with smaller floor plates so you can lease things up, given the potential downside risk where we are today?
You do Chicago first?
So Sterling Bay is, I guess we're pulling back significantly. We've made significant investments over the down cycle here. I think we've acquired probably 40 pieces of land or existing buildings to kind of have pipeline when we do see a market downturn. But we're seeing everything in Chicago priced to perfection. Values are up 300%. Too many competitors, both public and private. So what we've done is land banked all of our assets, and we're going to purposefully execute them over the next 5 years. But we're very concerned where we are in the cycle.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you the past. We had our most active sales cycle the last 6 to 9 months. We've sold a tremendous amount of properties, a build-to-suit to Samsung down in Mountain View, office buildings around the city. But I can't keep Matt from going out and chasing new deals, so maybe Matt should tell you.
I'm the problem.
So Matt should tell you what he's been working on. But we do think that the nature of what we're going after is different than it was, obviously, 2 years ago.
I think that's right. I mean, we think there's still legs in the market, but we are definitely sensitive to structure and how we're doing properties. We have an old hospital site in Presidio Heights that we are working on, and we have a structure there that we don't close till we're entitled. It has a very long runway because the hospital's got to build its new location. So we like the cycle risk is mitigated by not needing to do something tomorrow. And we still think there's legs in the market. We're just chasing things a little differently. Some of the strategy we're looking at is, if you just look at the displacement that's occurring from just Google and Apple alone, what's happening in Silicon Valley, and I'd add the Irvine company, which is basically knocking down Santa Clara. Really, R&D building transformations, and as these companies are acquiring all those properties, those businesses need to go somewhere. And so we're very focused on what the impacts from corporate transformations in Silicon Valley are doing, and the same thing's happening in San Francisco. And so we're trying to be in front of the curve where we see opportunity for catching that displacement.
And we're also, I think it's safe to say that, we both agree that there's legs in the market. The problem with the market is it's not a lot of height left. So every time a new price comes out, we gulp. Today, one came out at 20 California Street, a 60,000-ish building just sold for, and I know, it's not a great building. It's a nice little building. Sold for
Unless you're in the audience.
$800 a square foot. OMG. There's a lot of capital still chasing deals. So we're trying to look a little bit outside of the core of San Francisco. We've got a deal we're working on. It'll probably close in hopefully the next 30 days in Oakland. We're looking in San Jose. Markets that were less than the hot spot 2-3 years ago, but are on the curve. And if the market lasts long enough, then they'll continue to become more accepted in all facets of life, art, living, and officing. So we're still looking at things.
Next question.
My name is Joseph Grant. I'm from Seattle. So Seattle's a pretty new city compared to Chicago and the East Coast. What would you say, I guess, is the cutoff point for a charming historical building worth saving versus just mid-century reinforced concrete, nothing worth saving, tear it down?
Mm-hmm. We were just up there last week visiting with a developer friend of ours. And we were walking through Pioneer Square and that historic district, sort of south, I think it is, of the Four Seasons area, the rest of the hotel. And we were like going, how can we not buy all this stuff? It's just gorgeous buildings that aren't kind of caught on yet in terms of the rehab potential. I think Seattle is the target of an article today, if I'm not mistaken, either ULI or something. I saw it run across my iPad this morning, with the fear of too much tech and too much development and changing the nature of the city. So it's we're now the poster child for what not to do, apparently. But I think Seattle, those brick buildings, as Matt said with ours, you can't replace some of the bones and you can't replace the look. And you probably couldn't tear it, in our city, you couldn't tear it down if you wanted to. So, but they're great assets, and you just got to kind of, now the break point.
I think low ceilings, you get a 8-foot, 9-foot deck to deck,
Yeah.
that's going to have me probably, if I can't figure out some way to connect the floors, cut a big opening or something. Low ceilings pretty hard. Ridiculous column grid where you're basically reframing the whole thing. Maybe that's too hard. We've seen some buildings that have 16-foot grid. That's really tough to work in.
Unless there's no vacancy.
Then
at least
yeah. There's certain things that I think you're just going to look at. There's certain things about the building intrinsics that you'd like to have be good. They don't have to be perfect. Our building had a 24-foot column grid, which is awkward if you think about buildings are built in 5s. So the curtain wall wants to be in 5s. Offices are 10 feet. Conference rooms are 15 feet. Things work in 5s. Well, when you're in 6s, everything's a little awkward. And if you put offices around the perimeter of a building that has a 24-foot grid and you wanted a 10 by 12 office, you have to rotate it from what it would normally be, and you lose a certain number of offices. So you just kind of go through this math in your head. when we looked at it and said, we can live with 24 feet, it's weird. We're gonna have to deal with a lot of incongruities for the way the curtain wall manufacturer wants to do things, but the deck-to-deck was great, the plate size was great. We can live with the grid. So I think it's intrinsic to each building, the question, and frankly, if you tear it down, could you put it back up is one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, do I have square footage in excess of code?
Right.
And that's
There's a real
gonna
value in that.
that's gonna lean me pretty hard to finding something to save.
Right. I would also add that, in terms of an aesthetic style that may be more attractive than others, in the commercial office market, we're seeing the quirkier the better. Tenants these days, they don't want the traditional rectangular box, that their dad worked in the 60s. So if it's an odd layout, as long as the economics work, if it's got, some unusual angles to it, that's all a plus in the commercial market that we're seeing right now. But for those things that Matt mentioned in terms of, low ceiling heights, deck to deck is tough to fix. You can't make that work in my experience. I haven't seen that work. As long as the superstructure is salvageable, that's really what you're looking at in terms of an adaptive reuse. That's probably the biggest thing we look at first.
We had a building, to that point, we had a building that was an old brewery, the Ham's Brewery here. And it was a series of buildings that, it was a brewery, and we'd just been pushed together. And none of the floors in the building were flat. And you say leveling, when I say flat, I mean there are stairs in the middle of every single floor. You had to go down 4 or 6, sometimes it was 10, because the floor heights were absolutely different everywhere. It was perfect.
Yeah,
It was
exactly.
perfect.
Okay, on this side, a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can help us give us some insight into your thought process on the valuation on the buy, given the uncertainty in the construction cost. You said that, maybe jokingly that you didn't have the strategy, but given how much uncertainty there is in these rehabilitation projects, how do you know what's a reasonable price to pay when you first get into it or look around the building?
I think it depends where you are in the cycle. For us, we looked at it and said that the price we were paying for the building was less than replacing the slabs and columns and getting the land for free. So while the math didn't necessarily work perfectly at the time, we said it's gonna work. And we did a lot of diligence like these guys did to know what we thought it was gonna cost. Maybe not perfectly, but what we thought it was gonna cost. And we've done it enough times to know the places that we needed extra contingency. So I think we had we had a long enough time to diligence so that we were smart about it. And we knew that at some point the math was gonna work. It'd be different if you told me I have to buy that same building today and I'm gonna be above replacement cost to do it. That's a different equation. So I think it really depends when you're making the buy as to how that strategy works. When you buy at the bottom, which I enjoy buying at the bottom because I'm thinking, I don't know how I'm gonna make money, but I'm pretty sure I'm not gonna lose money. That's a very different thesis than when you're buying in the upper part of the momentum.
Okay, that was our strategy.
Yep.
So for Chicago, we bought it 2010, 2011, we closed, I think.
2011.
So you'll be surprised by the metrics. We paid $12 million for the building, so we thought the dirt was worth more than the building. So had we taken off the facade and the structural integrity wasn't there, we would have just sold the dirt. So it's kind of asymmetrical risk. Buy it, limit your downside, but on the upside, for instance, this building, the total project costs were $175 million, and this building's worth $300 million today. If we were to buy this building in this marketplace today with no windows, it would cost $350 a foot. So we're not interested in that at all. And there's a lot of folks that are.
Yeah, they probably shared the most valuable thing I've heard all morning long. I mean, the way Randy Rowe, our new chairman, did a one-on-one with Sam Zell for some young leaders in Chicago. I wasn't one of the young leaders, wish I was. It was striking on how deeply he would dive into risk management and understanding all the contingencies and really do a deep dive on that. That was Sam's advice, and I think it's in evidence in terms of the way you guys did those deals. Question over here?
Thank you guys. It was a great presentation. You both had these design and construction challenges with your projects, and Matt talked about having some loan risk with construction overruns. How did you guys rally your design and construction team to perform and get this done on time, under budget?
It's a good question. And I tell you, it's as much art as it is science. You know, we build a team on these things ourselves. You know, from a developer owner standpoint, we're extremely involved from the get-go. It's not as though we just hire a design team and tell them to get back to us in a month. We sit in the meetings, we perform the due diligence with our crews. We also, as I mentioned in my presentation, we challenge our consultants to be creative. You know, on our project, I had 3 structural engineers. I had 1 structural engineer performing due diligence, I had 1 performing testing, and I had 1 doing new design, and I had them all challenging each other. And I was the referee. You know, if it made sense to me, then it probably was going to work. You know, if the 3 of them could agree on something enough, but there was still argument over is this better than that, and I could understand it, and that felt pretty good. And that's a model that works for us. You know, on our deal, structure was a big challenge. So we spent many months with a lot of smart people and challenged them to be creative and to challenge each other and to manage them.
I think we operate really similarly to that, where we're deeply involved. We are running the process. And I think if you get the right group of people and you have a whole bunch of creative people in a room, they're looking for somebody that wants to drive for a solution. And you make the process with a rigid schedule, but you don't make it punitive to people. You're challenging them to be creative.
Right.
And I think it is art more than science. Cracking the whip on somebody at some point just stops being effective. And I think what you need is everybody pushing each other in the design team to all make a date. And when your outcomes are good, and these guys have a track record, as do we, people want to work on those projects.
Since we're local, we might as well do a shout out. A lot of the success of these kinds of rehabs are based on picking the right contractor that knows what they're doing. Rehabs are really difficult, so we use plant construction here on a lot of our historic and complicated rehabs. And you know, they're as much a part of the family and the team as anybody. And then we have Matt, and we have a construction manager who's full-time. And so we just really, you have to focus on it, otherwise it'll get away from you.
I think, to Mike's point, we've used plant on probably 15 projects, and you know, it's critical. Building a team at the beginning, you can't hire the architect and then let them run with an idea and then hire a contractor. We generally start with the structural engineer first. He gets to choose first before the architect. What's the way we're going to fix the box? Then the architect can clad it. We're going to have the contractor sitting in the room where we're going to know, your skin budget's this much per lineal foot, or per surface area foot, things like that. So they're all designing to a budget in the beginning. That way you don't get a process where you get a budget later and you're like, what do you mean the skin costs this much? We'll have the skin contractor in early, all those things early so that you can drive the process quickly.
Very much agree. We had our contractor who was at our very first design meetings with our structural team and our design team, and they were an invaluable resource to the team. And just in terms of cost, in terms of logistics, in terms of buildability, you can have great ideas, but if they drive your cost up $10, $12 a foot, then maybe you need to look at a different idea.
One last question. I want to be respectful of one of our panelists who has to catch a flight, but the other panelists will be around for questions at the end. Are there other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Mitch Rudin. In your leasing of the building, neither of you mentioned the presence or absence of amenities either in the building or adjacent to the project. It looked like not much there as a consideration. How did you address that, and was that a tenant consideration for yours?
Yeah, from our standpoint, it was a big consideration. Really, all of our creative commercial offices in Chicago in the last 3, 4, 5 years have involved a ton of amenities. 2 roof decks on this building, dog run, fitness center, bike storage, bike repair facility, coffee facility, indoor parking, 1 block to the L train in Chicago. What else am I missing in this deal?
We have 3 independent restaurants that were willing to go into the retail space. The industrial nature of this area belies what actually is there. It's kind of foodie row, so there's tons of restaurants in that immediate area.
Plus, every space in this building has some degree of outdoor space, whether it's access to the common roof deck, access for the big tenants to a private roof deck, or access to private terraces and balconies on every commercial office space. Every tenant has that, and that's a huge game changer.
But honestly, the reason why this building leased to 100% occupancy is because of the authentic nature of the location and the building.
I think we had very, very similar stuff where we had ground floor retail amenities, we had multiple decks in the building. And candidly, the neighborhood is the amenity. If you walk out the door, you know, you guys are here, I mean, walk 2 blocks over, you'll see, I mean, you're already in the neighborhood. There's a zillion restaurants. When we have I'm sure you get this, our projects seem to always be in the center of everything, no matter where they're located. And when we did our, you know, a ring around the project, you can start to say, okay, you're 2 blocks from all the major hotels, you're 2 blocks from meeting facilities, you're 3 blocks from the BART stop, and there were 110 restaurants within 3 blocks. And there were 4 gyms. We didn't feel compelled because of that to build a lot of, you know, fitness type amenity into the building. And interestingly, Macy's took the building because they wanted their employees to be in the neighborhood. They didn't want to build sort of a cloistered, closeted environment. They didn't want a suburban campus. They wanted an urban campus.
So I'd like to thank these panelists. Please join me.